Hello there, comrades, and welcome back to yet another beautiful video. Today, this video is going to cover two separate yet related topics. One that I've wanted to speak about for quite a while, and yet I never had a real opportunity to link it into any videos that I talk about, as they are more fashion related, and this is definitely on the side of politics and history, which is my other great passion of life. The other section will be focused on a side of fashion that I rarely see talked about. And this is shocking to me that it isn't brought up more, and even more shocking once I did research into the variety of fashion that actually existed within this time period, which I had no clue about, especially from a country that I was not expecting to be as broad and open as they were. First of all, I'm going to be mentioning art here. I'm going to be mentioning art, fashion, and theater. All of these I want to bring under a sort of broader definition, and I'm going to pull that from an unreleased writing of mine titled The Checksums of the Interplay of Aesthetic Truth on Reality. And within that, I give art the following definition: the manipulation of a single up to infinite shapes and colors in connection with even the slightest bit of meditation upon the outcome by the author of the manipulation. Fashion throughout history has been one of, if not the most important forms of personal expression. Not only for the individual, though, but of the times and the place that they lived in, as no one can truly escape the influences of their surroundings. And no surrounding, at least in my opinion, had more of an impact on the individuals that existed within them than the communist regimes.
And we don't like federal agents.
From Mao to Stalin, a very deliberate and straightforward form of art was used to attempt the unification of the working class and express nationalism for said working class. Socialist realism is the name of that art form and of the style that gave us pieces such as these. And this style gave us pieces such as this. And this style gave us pieces such as these. Unfortunately, if you were to deviate from socialist realism, especially within the USSR, no matter how great your intentions were with your art, you were labeled a formalist and your art discarded. What does that mean exactly? Well, it's going to mean two things. Either one, your art form deviated from socialist realism, so your art contained some sort of deeper, hidden message or meaning within it that wasn't immediately understood from the viewer and maybe questioned the governance of your country at the time. The second, you had a political rival who hated you and they wanted to create a witch hunt against your art. And it was most often the latter. One of my favorite examples of someone who had phenomenal intentions with their art, and they were massive actually within the sphere of East Germany and the USSR, was our man here, Brecht. And he was a playwright, and yet he wished to revolutionize, he wished to create a revolution within the art form of theater. And what's so unique about him is when you think of a revolution in art today, there's going to be two things that come to mind. Either you're thinking of a new form of technology that either changes how the artist is creating art directly with their hands, or in the case of AI, a very negative thing for art, yet it is still a revolution. It is a new form of technology that has shifted the landscape of art entirely. Either way, Brecht wished to revolutionize theater, and he wasn't doing it through technology. The other way you would think of a revolution would be politically, And obviously, as we know, he wouldn't have been able to do that, but he also didn't. And if that was the case, yes, the martyring of him with this scornful word of formalist would have been warranted, but still unjustified. However, neither of these were the ways that he wished to revolutionize theater. He wished to revolutionize theater intellectually, something that would empower and embolden the people, something very much communist at its core. Yet his attempts of adding an additional layer of critical thinking to the theater were demonized and later forgotten. He was a victim of the rigid guidelines set forward by the socialist realism art scene and what was acceptable in the USSR. His story can be summed up with the phrase, "You can't take politics out of politics." And yet I want to abstract that phrase one step further, which is you can't take art out of politics. That is to say, not the other way around. So in this case, art shall always be a political tool, if not the most important one at the disposal of any politician of any age. And it's sad too, because he, as I was saying, had such great intentions. He was rejected as a formalist during the time of the USSR, and by the time of the collapse, he was lumped in with the old. So he was too new for the old and too old for the new. Either way, Brett, The Man and His Work is an amazing book. If you care about either of those subjects I sort of covered, definitely worth the read. To sum up all of that jargon that I was just sort of spewing there, art was and is a potent tool for political motivations. And the past communist countries not only knew this very well, but used it to its fullest extent. So, with all this in place, what role did communist fashion serve in pursuing a workers' nation? The straightforward answer is reasonable to discern. The rejection of Western fashion helped ensure there was no visual distinction, monetary-wise that is, between the people to further communist ideas. To continue off of this idea, I do believe it is necessary to note observations of Hannah Arendt in her writings titled Labor, Work, and Action, where on page 30 she writes, "The things of the world have the function of stabilizing human life, and their objectivity lies in the fact that men, their ever-changing nature notwithstanding, can retrieve their idea by being related to the enduring sameness of an object, the same chair today and tomorrow, the same house formerly from birth to death." And it's impossible to deny that despite fashion being an ever-shifting depiction of reality, by turning it into this utilitarian product, especially in relation with a message pushed by the art, it gains its very separate importance of being an extension of the person who owns the object. And so once again, this is such a powerful tool as an extension of the human itself to push your political ideas. We shall start with the most widely known example of communist fashion, which came a little further east than the USSR, the Mao Suit. Arguably the most iconic piece of communist fashion, and what we'll be making later in this video. The suit was, ironically enough, first worn by Marx. I'm kidding. Of course it was worn by Mao. To add salt to the injury of such a terrible joke I made there, a further correction is the suit was first worn by Sun Zongshan, and it was specifically made for the founding of the Revolutionary Party, and from 1920 until his death in 1925, he would exclusively wear that or a scholarly robe, and then later, of course, this suit was adopted by Mao. This suit quickly, after the Cultural Revolution in China, became the de facto outfit for men and women of the early CCP. Being seen as individualistic at this time was dangerous. And so the Mao suit in blue, gray, sometimes green, were really your limits of fashion, despite maybe a military officer's outfit. However, this only lasted until the fall of Mao, and with the opening up of international markets, this slowly changed. And we see the result today, where China is now this powerhouse of fashion, not in the regards of what, their manufacturing power, but we have so many influential designers coming out of China, and influential designers who have admitted, such as Ziggy Chen, that if they were to come out with their brand 30 years ago in the 90s, it would have not had success. And yet it has shifted so quickly that he's able to be an extraordinarily influential designer now within the entire world, nevertheless the sphere of China. And don't forget Uma Wang. Anyone who is a designer under labelhood, there is so much influence coming out of somewhere where less than 100 years ago, you could only really wear one outfit, the USSR. Heading back west, the USSR had a shockingly different and quite broad clothing options under communism. And this is something that I was not expecting at all. The variety of colors, patterns, and shapes that were acceptable at the time were completely unexpected. Of course, the main limitation here was resources. Stalin did, though, have a radically different approach to art than Mao. The USSR wanted modernity mixed with its communism, and wished to push this through the arts, to the extent that in 1935, Stalin opened Dom Modeli, his actual very own fashion house. Designers also at the same time, such as Stepanova, were able and allowed to push forward with their creative visions and made some of the most fantastic jumpsuits I've ever seen. And this also shocked me. You're seeing a lot of 80s-esque influences, and yet these designs that bordered on mixing together, once again, both the sort of lack of class and also not lack of style, lack of class, as well as lack of gender are phenomenal. It merged so much together and also still managed to bring in older Russian influences, such as the patterns and shapes and florals that were involved in the pre-communist Russia. Other designers, such as Elsa Schiaparelli, were brought in to head Dom Modeli and give us further insight to the fashion of the USSR at the time. Writing in her biography, "I was of the opinion that the clothes of the working people should be simple and practical. Instead, she said that she found a collection better suited to a cocktail party." Enough just talking about this fashion, and especially the Mao suit. Let's make one. Let's make this suit. So, I have some patterns that I cut out here, more over there, and a small caveat to the actual suit I'm going to be making, which I'm going to use the excuse of the fact that fabric was limited back then, so it's going to be historically accurate. But the real thing is, I wanted to get this out of the way because I wanted this video to come out, and so I didn't have time to specifically order fabric, and thus I am reusing a very large shirt. I've deconstructed it, and that is the fabric that we're going to use. So the real caveat here is that the sleeves are going to be different from what they are meant to be for this suit. But with that all out of the way, let's make this. I also did some drawings on here too while I was bored last night. And we are going to take out our fabric, and then of course align our patterns on said fabric. Here I have my separate pocket patterns. I realize that I'm going to have to cut a collar pattern, so we'll get to that. And this is the beautiful reused fabric that we are about to cut on. So, of course, I am going to do this as authentically as possible. Usually I don't. Usually I go very sporadic with my own designs. When I'm actually going to be following the Muslim center line here, PTSD back to fashion school, but this is going to be very lined up how it's meant to be. Beautiful words. What's really unique about the transition to the Mao suit in Soviet fashion, or at least in Chinese fashion, is it was a major development shift in the fashion they were already doing. So this suit was actually, and this is not to take away the beautiful pre-communist Chinese fashion pieces. But this was technically, and not technically as in maybe, but technically as in skill technicality, more intensive than the traditional Chinese clothing. It involved very specifically hand-sewn buttonholes. It involved attaching the sleeve all the way instead of leaving an opening at the bottom, which you traditionally see with more Eastern fashion. So this really was a shift in many, many ways for the country of China when it came to fashion. So more than just the revolutionary aspect, this was a big leap forward in the way that clothing was made. It also resulting in a lot of the very first households. It led to the very first few households getting a consumer-grade sewing machine, which was huge at the time and was probably one of the most expensive capitalist-esque items that you were able to actually buy. But yeah, this piece was very influential in definitely more than one way. I'm going to assure that this is perfectly lined up here. I have a nice counterweight to assure that it stays in place, and I'm just going to be using a chalk pen. So this is able to wash out, but it will also leave a bit more of a mark, no pun intended, than if it was just by itself. This is also pretty different for me. I do not traditionally use patterns in my sewing. I like to look and study patterns, especially, funny enough, I would say Russian patterns from about the 17th century to the 18th century. I think they're very fascinating. And then, of course, more of the imperial French patterns, too, just because of how gorgeous some of those creations are. Okay, let's see. Different format mode, but we have each side of our front with our pockets on the inside for both, hand stitched in, and now we will be finishing up the seams so they are not raw. Same for down here, adding some buttons, and then finally putting the whole thing together. And now the question is, how many buttons does it take to make a Mao suit? There's no joke there, it's 5. Part 2. False communism, fake names, and paradiasal. There are two great empires that come to mind when the subject of communism is brought up. Both have already been talked about in this video, so there is no real pride in guessing the two that I am thinking of. Both forming around the same time, both forged through brutal revolutions and even brutaler regimes. Both formed by leaders who directly state their influence of Marx and continue to add upon this great thinker's writings. However, neither of these empires ever adhered to communism. The Russian Empire and the Republic of China at the time of the communist transformations were peasant countries. The literacy rate of Russia right before the communist transformation was at 28%, and that population of 28% was either in St. Petersburg or Moscow. Hardly anyone in mainland Russia was able to read. For the Republic of China, much the same can be said. However, these were countries where the people were greatly mistreated by the ruling class. These were countries where those people who rose up were justified in doing so, and should not be shamed for latching on to the hopes of the ideologies of Marx. However, lacking the technology and the resources to follow the correct steps of forming a communist regime. Marx believed that a communist regime would form with the collapse of a fully late-stage capitalist one. A transition that would be possible due to the abundance of technology and resources being hoarded by the bourgeois of the said country. In a scenario like this, the transformation would follow into a socialist regime, for each according to his ability, to each according to his work, and finally with the help of a dictator of the proletariat. And do note that part, it would fully metamorphosize into a communist regime, for each according to his abilities, to each according to his need. Remember my comment a few seconds ago about a dictator of the proletariat? The single concept is a major point of contention, and is what I'm going to say was the second fatal flaw of the USSR and the CCP after its incorrect movements of economies, from an aristocracy into communism, instead of aristocracy, capitalism, socialism, communism. Nowadays, and especially if you are not familiar with the thought processes of the past, Marx even suggesting something such as a dictator of the proletariat sounds extremely contradictory to the idea of communism itself. However, I am led to believe this stems from the ideas of Hobbes, who, in defense of his monarchy, states that the people without a leader, in the state of nature, a natural state, are in a state of war, of constant fear and self-protection and fighting. And so in this state of nature and state of war, a dictator is far more appealing than no leader at all. A dictator can create order relative to the state of war, and so to appoint one in these cases is logical. Everyone with hindsight, though, is able to see the now glaring issue that is brought with this sort of idea. Those who took power and were meant to return it to the people after communism was achieved decided to just make themselves the sole bourgeois of an entire country. A modern-day monarchy. The result for the USSR, and I obviously understand that these two shortcomings of incorrect economic transition and dictator were not the only reasons for the collapse, but it is no longer here. But the CCP is a capitalist dictatorship wearing the thin veil of communism in what can only be understood now as a pure lack of motivation and laziness from the party leaders to just change the name of their party. How is it going with this false communist regime? Why don't we take some fundamental concepts of communism from Marx? Number one, to each according to his ability, to each according to his need. A phrase I brought up before. Well, the distribution of wealth in modern-day China is point for point identical to the United States of America. 10% of the population owns a bit over 60% of the wealth. No more empirical evidence than those statistics alone needs to be said to make my point there. Where am I going with all this? I want to acknowledge that Marx made mistakes in his assumptions of the future in regards to his communist ideology. One, he did not assume the institutions of capitalist countries would bail out capitalism itself, such as during the 2008 financial crisis. And second, he misassumed how the modern-day proletariat would other referentially compare themselves to the bourgeois, instead of comparing themselves and their wages to their capitalist suppressors, they compare themselves to others in similar places. So a mechanic would compare his pay to, let's say, a UPS driver or someone else in a similar labor-focused position, in comparison to those who own the means of production and are benefiting off of their work. Why is a country then, such as the USSR or modern-day China, knighting themselves with the name of communism a negative for communist ambitions? Paradisal is a rhetorical device that uses the morphing of the semantics of a word or concept to the will of the wielder of this rhetorical trick. A very known example is from the book 1984, where the world is submerged in paradisal tricks, such as war is peace. When a dictatorship and non-communist country dons the name of communism, it distorts its semantic significance and meaning to those who are not head down in the readings of such a movement or Marx. This distortion indirectly helps capitalism, as communism is no longer seen as a salvation for the proletariat by the masses, but a trap, a distortion of what they have grown up with, a concept that is formed purely by the fear-mongering of the United States government. However, more importantly, the empires that attempted to be communist made every possible mistake along the way of doing so, at every step, every level. They were maybe communist the very first months of their revolution, but they were not when the USSR fell, and the CCP is not communist now. I want this to be cleared up, especially for people that do not understand communism. And I am aware that almost anyone watching this, especially to this point, is most likely not in that group of people. But I still wish to put that message forward. Communism didn't fail, because it was never even properly tried. And it might just be the solution now. For a country that has the technology to transition properly, a country with the resources, the power, the knowledge, the most considerable wealth disparity ever seen in history, and the most corrupt, encroaching, evil bourgeois we have ever seen. Communism for the US, communism for us. Thank you all very much for watching this video, especially the latter half, as it is quite radically, and I will use that word radically with intention there, different from my other videos, but it is a passion, as I said, I care about just as much as fashion, and I always attempt to bleed both of them into each other. And a great example is my brand Row Trading, where it only works off of a barter system. Either way, sorry for that self-insert there. I hope you all enjoyed this video and learned something. And as always, have an amazing day. Paradisal?